invited him to speak about Gandhiji. I was too busy preparing, so I said, so please I invite him to be here, and I think he's done some wonderful work on Gandhi's ideas on education. Ashish Rajpal is a co-founder and managing director of iDiscover Education, which is involved in creating and facilitating learning programs on teacher development, leadership, innovation, and cultural transformation. His areas of interest include constructive classrooms, emotional literacy of children, and non-authoritarian leadership. And I think Ashish will introduce a little more about himself.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me at the back? Is it loud enough? A little bit louder? Yeah? Okay. I'll just work myself up. I'm not in perfect health, so I'm a little bit under the weather, but I think once we get going, I'll be okay. So I sound a little bit low, it's not because I mean to, I just feel a little bit low. Oh, of course, that's the highlight. There's something magical about them when they are 12. Not that it goes away, but it becomes harder to see, I think, for everyone, including themselves. And at least that's been my experience. Okay, it's not easy to delve into a topic that is as broad as this, and it's somewhat intimidating to see an international audience which perhaps has come with a lot of daunting expectations. So I think I'll serve myself well by perhaps setting the expectation of what we are getting into here. And even if it's not exactly what we came for, perhaps in some small way, it will enhance your own understanding of this area of work. I stumbled into Gandhi as a young citizen seeking direction on how to impact the social domain of education in my own country. And what I'm going to be sharing with you is my own journey and understanding as to how some of the thoughts, both from his writings as well as from his life, have impacted our own work. So to that extent, it is a somewhat first-hand narrative. Hopefully not in a self-aggrandizing way at all, but hopefully with an authenticity where there is something more to it than just words and theory or maybe another narrative. I'm not an expert on Gandhi. I'm not even an expert on education for that matter. I, like a lot of people who work in iDiscover, I am a gatecrasher into education. Who's taken matters which have really concerned you very deeply and you don't see enough being done about it, and jumped into the domain and say, if I don't do it, how do I have the right to ask anyone else? And from my personal perspective, the most seductive part of who Gandhi was or what he stood for is the idea of action. And hence, I have chosen to title this short presentation as Action is My Domain. If everything Gandhi wrote and said was on one side and these four letters were on the other, I would choose these. And perhaps Gandhiji himself would have chosen these. Because he said, whenever asked, so what is your message? He would almost always say, my life is my message. However, I think pretty much with anything which has been around for a long time, be it scripture, be it ancient wisdom, be it tales of success from the past, reinterpretation for a modern era becomes a key issue. And I think reinterpretation, when underestimated, leads to the kind of dangerous orthodoxy our world is facing in its worst form in pockets all over the world. We were having this small banter here about there is something on Tagore tomorrow and I think Krishnamurti day after. And there's someone coming from a Krishnamurti institution and someone coming from a Tagore institution. And I was like, poor Gandhi kind of got left out. So it was down to people like me to come and tell his version of education. And I think someone thoughtfully said that perhaps he was misunderstood. Maybe he was misunderstood, or perhaps in the seeds of his message were the possibility of misunderstanding. So we will examine some of that today. In terms of specifics, we are starting about 15 minutes late, and I hope to finish on time, or maybe be 5 minutes over, so we have about 10 minutes to make up. So we'll speak for roughly half an hour, if I can remember to remind myself. And these are the 4 things I have planned for you. After which we can take hopefully some comments, questions, discussion, whatever you like. Unlike Gandhi, I still need an introduction, so I'll briefly describe what I'm up to and the kind of work I do. I want to take some time in to share with you the experience, which was actually a research piece through which I stumbled and discovered the idea of Gandhi about 7 years ago. And I think that's important both to bring the authenticity of what we are talking about, as well as the relevance for education, certainly in the context of India and possibly elsewhere. Emanating from the research and our own work is our theory of change for education as a domain. And I would like to briefly share that. But as you probably guessed by now, I'm the kind of gets very impatient with theory fairly quickly. And what we really want to get into it is the so what factor. So what? So what can I do today when I go back to my school or to my institution or to my work, which perhaps could get impacted favorably by some of this? And that's when I'll basically talk around 4 ideas which I think are very relevant to modern day education. And perhaps also touch on a couple of controversies which Gandhiji's brand of education, call it Nayi Taaleem or call it Bunyadi Shiksha, has raised. And perhaps there were the seeds of misunderstanding. So that's the broad plot. If that's okay, does that kind of sound like a frequent plan to get some body language? Okay, just a quick kind of query. How many of us are in a school? Either we run a school or head a school or teach. Excellent, brilliant. Oh, that's good. How many of us have taught in a classroom ourselves in the last 12 months? 10. Thank you. Okay, let's get the introduction out of the way. Entrepreneurs who want to change the face of education in our country. We are working in a model which we think needs to be both progressive as well as viable. And one of the most interesting ideas in Gandhi's whole domain of thinking around education was the economic aspects of work products that you create. I think that's a very compelling idea. The work we do, if you were to put labels to it, falls in the realm of curriculum design, teacher education, school management, leadership development in schools. Like I mentioned to you, I'm a gate crasher. I grew up in Delhi and in a middle class home, so I had to go get a job. For about 10 years, I worked around the world in a multinational career, selling everything from soap to other things I'd rather not talk about. And just when most of my peers and well-wishers thought that I had no reason to disturb all of that, I quit my job in Paris and decided to come back to India and work in education. And I think one of the most fortunate experiences I had is I went and spent a year at Harvard University doing a master's in education. And the research I'll share was under the supervision of Howard Gardner, who is a guru of sort and has been a beacon of, I think, good sense amongst other things. I'm not alone in this. I discovered today has about 100 odd people who have staked out in a similar way. Some of them come from the other world like I did, but the vast majority are former teachers, school heads, principals, PhDs, academics, and all of them are kind of driven by this urge to make a difference. Over the last 6 years, we worked with several thousand teachers, several hundred schools across the country, And all of this has been distilled into a program which goes by the name of Exceed, which I'm most proud to say is now reaching the smallest towns of India. In places where I thought it would probably take us 4 or 5 years to go to. And after I finished today, Anshul and I are going to be traveling across Tamil Nadu visiting schools. And the fascinating part of this is that I think the conventional wisdom, whether it is here or in North America or Europe or elsewhere, that good progressive education is for rich, affluent kids, and a lot of this doesn't work when you get down to the level below that. I've got evidence on the ground to prove that nothing could be further from the truth. It works. However, it works in certain conditions and certain laws need to be obeyed. So that is the nature of our work. We're beginning to work with governments around the place. We're working with the Bhutanese government. We're writing the national education framework for Bhutan. We're beginning to talk to state governments. And I think it's important to have the disclaimer up front that we are coming from the Gandhi who led the freedom movement in India as opposed to the Gandhi who was at the Tolstoy farm or the Phoenix farm alone. While I do not underestimate the importance of Phoenix and Tolstoy in making what he was, but I think mass change is something which is very core to our vision and what we want to do. I make this point because I think for a lot of people or organizations like ours, wanting to set up one school and do a good job would be just fine. And I think that's glorious work. But we need to understand what we want, because if you get confused about who you are and what we seek, I think there's a mismatch. Okay, so enough about us. I'll begin with the research study and the general investigation into, so if you wanted to do something significant to change education, where would you start? Well, as someone told me, if you have to look for a start, then probably you're not ready. It was discontent or unhappiness with the status quo, which I think led my own inquiry into where we needed to go. And if you look at the context of the era into which an idea like Gandhi was born, the Industrial Revolution was just peaking, the imperialism of the West was complete, there was an unjust Indian society, and a timid and sensitive Indian youth which wanted to be like their rulers. There was nothing more irrational or out of line than wanting to take on the powers that be and change what existed. Cut to 100 years later, at the turn of the century, which is about 8 years ago, I think if you look at it from an Indian perspective, in many ways it was similar, right? Or it is similar. There is a privileged trust at the top. Everybody is chasing the economic dream, which belongs to 10% of the country. The vast majority lies neglected and ignored. There is a kind of education which Dr. Kumar spoke about in the morning, so I will not repeat what he said. And the vision for vast change in the way the society is or the ideals of what our country could be was perhaps missing. It was in that context that when I got this opportunity to work with Dr. Gardner, he said to us that I am embarking on a project called the Good Work Project. Dr. Gardner, for those of you who may be familiar with him, is like Mr. Multiple Intelligence. That's how he is. That's his kind of other name. However, the project I was working with him on, he had moved well past multiple intelligence and was examining what he called good work, which was defined as work that is both creative and ethical. That was the definition of good work. And to that extent, there is a distinction in this definition of work that is excellent as well as true compared to work that is good. So work that is good is both excellent as well as ethical. So I jumped at this opportunity. I said, Dr. Gardner, I want to go and examine during the course I'm working with you. You see that I come from a country which, has a laundry list of problems. There's no dearth of social problems. It's enough for 2 or 3 lifetimes. But why do young Indians who may have similar talents and privileges, some want to go and do something about it, whereas others are perfectly happy being dentists in Texas or going to Silicon Valley and working on the IT dream? Not to say there's anything wrong with that, but I was curious about, is there a difference? And the underlying agenda was that if India was to see vast change in education, in a global perspective, if education was to see dramatic change over the course of our lifetime, then you need lots of men and women like this to come into the domain. So what is it that makes them come? So that was the question which was eating me, and I said, okay, maybe this is the opportunity to get into. So when you work in an institution like that, with a man like that, you need to kind of think through and give some strong reasons. And so I identified 2 or 3 areas as to how to attack this problem. I said perhaps there were some factors, intrinsic and extrinsic, which make these people make these decisions. Perhaps there is something in the domain itself which attracts people to it or not. And at that time there was a study which Howard Gardner was doing on what makes biotechnology hugely attractive to good people to wanting to do good work, whereas say media doesn't. And one of his findings was that the nature of the domain is such. For instance, in media, a young journalist wants to write about what's happening in Africa. But for the newspaper owner, that's not a very profitable story to fly people around. And at the end of the day, people want to read who's sleeping at home. So there's a fundamental disconnect in the domain itself. In biotechnology, everybody wants to live longer. The companies want to make a lot of money by inventing new drugs, and young kids want to work on research that is world class. Everything fits. The third dimension I found or suggested was that India and the world at large, this is before Barack Obama came along, is in the need of role models. And the hypothesis was that the last major movement we had in our country was the freedom movement led by Gandhi. So what is the value of Gandhi as a role model, and does his own life suggest something as to where this could go? So based on this, I developed a framework. I'm not going to get into the alphabetic details of this, but very broadly, based on the preliminary research I did on reading up both on Gandhi's life as well as interviewing some of the young Indians I was going to be working with, there were these 4 hypotheses developed. The first hypothesis was that if you look at the choices Gandhiji made in the course of his life, primarily starting with the South African experience, there were some unusual acts of courage. And from a personality orientation, the question was, so if young people are going to make these kind of choices to want to go into education reform or social change, is it about having the courage to take these kind of decisions? So that was the first hypothesis, that it probably is. The second hypothesis was that the early social experiences of these people are going to have a defining impact. So for those of you who may have read a bit of Gandhiji or even read Experiments with Truth, he talks elaborately about his early experience, relationship with his father, his encounters with the social custom and system, guilt around sex, the whole culture of casteism and the complex Hindu culture at that time, parts of which he was drawn to and part which he was repelled by. And religious practice perhaps had some role to play. My hypothesis, by the way, was that deeper the religious affiliation, the lower the likelihood of entering the domain of good work. Okay? And this was again drawn from Gandhi's own writings about his conflict around Hindu practice in his adolescent years. The third hypothesis was around self-esteem, that if you want to go into this kind of work, the chances are you feel good about yourself and you want to share that with others. There seems to be some evidence around that in Gandhi's life. And finally, this kind of work, which say many people may see as it pays you less, it's probably harder work, recognition comes after a long time. And a lot of people may say, so why do you want to do it? Perhaps people see some intrinsic joy of service which draws them to that. Okay? So I think it's important to establish this, and the reason I'm taking some time over it is because it will help with the flow of thinking. Anyway, cutting to what we found in the study, I think the overwhelming finding was that early socialization is the most critical to the choices which people are making in their adult life about what they want to do. So this was a pilot study. I spoke to about a dozen people who are making the choices to go to good work, a dozen people who are making very traditional choices of what I call excellent work. And what was very evident is that the group which was choosing the good work direction as defined by the study was shaped by what their mother and father did with them on their birthday instead of having a party, where they took them, the kind of places they showed them, their association with children less privileged than themselves, reinterpretation of unfortunate incidents that happened in the family, the kind of company their parents kept, the kind of schools they went to, seemed to be the most critical in defining difference between these two groups. In addition, I found some other differences which I will not elaborate on, but one of the somewhat disappointing findings from my perspective was that to the modern Indian, Gandhi as an idea or as an ideal was largely irrelevant. So the study is about 6 years old, and at that time Narayan Murthy, who is the chairman of India's largest software company, was the emerging ideal for young Indians. And after that, there was a huge vacuum. If you go down 10 years, if you talk to 15-year-olds, it's movie stars and cricketers. If you go down another 5 years, it's your parents. So it became clear as to what people were looking out towards. So you might ask that, okay, so you did this study, but what does this have to do with bringing change in education? I think it has a lot to do with education. Because I think it's going to take a lifetime or perhaps two to make some of the changes you're going to be talking about in the next 2 or 3 days. Which I'm sure in your own way, in your schools, whether they are Montessori driven or otherwise, you are already practicing. But remember, I'm coming from a perspective that if this was to happen in every nook and cranny, if this was to happen in every backyard, what would it take? And do you have a role in that or not? Certainly you do if you choose to have one. I think the one thing Gandhi's example tells you about change is the power of a simple idea. What Gandhi and his colleagues were trying to do in the context of the independence struggle was such a big idea, and if you were to start making it an academic lecture of the number of ideas they were attacking, starting with imperialism, colonialism, racism, you could write an entire series of books. Gandhi was talking to an audience which was overwhelmingly illiterate, poor, disenfranchised. He was able to reduce the idea, or arguably raise the idea, to a single concept which is understandable by almost everyone. And the word was Swaraj. Complete independence. And not a limited notion of independence, not independence from another power or another country, which was an accident of history perhaps amongst other things. But the power of the self, the power of I. That was the idea of Swaraj. And so there was so much squabbling, so much infighting, so many views and counter views. He wrote over all of it and said, you have a problem? Be the change you want to see. And you cannot take such an audacious stand, you cannot take such a moral high ground unless every cell in your body, every minute of your life lives that idea. So with very little clothing or very little left on his body, I think he was able to get away with a lot. And if you took a slightly more objective critical view, there's amazing amount of nonsense he got away with. If you examine some of his personal practices, you take some of his rigidities, idiosyncrasies, Gandhi got away with a lot. But perhaps deservedly so. Because for his entire generation, and probably one before and one after, there isn't another example of the same stature as to what is this notion of I. Complete Swaraj. So the message of the man was, and I think this is, if you try and start relating it to education, I'll loop the loop for you a little later, but I think the trends are visible already. How do you bring power to the powerless? His constituency there could not be a more powerless group of people he was trying to empower. So he needed to have a very sound theory, right? Otherwise it's like kamikaze, you're setting up yourself for disaster. Very, very simple concept. First, whenever in doubt, focus on yourself. You have a problem, what are you doing about it? Second, very, very hard to do. But almost every religious scripture in the world, one of my good fortunes part of this program, I read a little bit of scripture from all leading faiths in the world, speaks of separating the misdeed from the oppressor. So his message to his people was, eliminate the misdeed, not the oppressor. The focus of your anger should be the wrong that is being done, not the person who is doing the wrong. And third, elevated especially truth and also love to weapon grade power. And then coinage satyagraha or truth force, I think, resonates even today. Matching this theory were a clear set of practices. Reflection. So what went by way of prayer was actually deep, reflective practice. Long penance, going into fasting regimes. So almost taking upon yourself the charge of saying if something is going wrong, perhaps there is something I am not doing about it or I can do about it. So raising the role of self-reflection. Second, becoming the runner yourself. How often people in positions of authority end up saying that to themselves? Almost never. And build your own conviction. For the last 6 years, I have personally worked with a few thousand teachers. I teach grade 4 myself. And one thing that just drives me nuts, the expectations teachers have from themselves are so different from the ones they have from the children. And I'm not speaking of, enlightened schools like yours, I'm speaking about ordinary schools. But ordinary children are our constituency too. So if you expect children to be self-aware, when were you last self-aware? If you're quick to label children as slow learners, fast learners, this learner, that learner, when did you last learn something? If you expect children to be confident about their own conviction, about anything, whether it's photosynthesis or algebra, we routinely meet grade 4 teachers to tell them what is surface area. And I don't mean this in a way to deride anyone, but this is the truth, and probably it's true for me and some other things. You say, what is the surface area of this piece of paper? And they'll say, it's length into breadth. And you perhaps pick a cuboid and they say, okay, maybe it's these added together. And then you say, okay, this is a spherical object. What is the surface area? You say, this doesn't have surface area. Okay. So, this morning, one of the things which Dr. Kumar spoke about, I don't know if he meant to say it, but he was underplaying the importance of subject knowledge. I would have argued that way 5 years ago, but 5 years in the classroom, my views are completely the opposite. He spoke about the it. Your fascination with the it is a function of how deep you want to delve with it. And once there is interest, once there is seduction in the subject matter, a lot of other things get taken care of. So I have probably moved 180 degrees from that. Anyway, coming back to the theory of change, and then we'll use that here and move very quickly to the 4 messages around education. This is where we came out. We said, if we look at the freedom movement as a role model, and Gandhi's work, which was spanning nearly 6 or 7 decades, one of the miracles was how long he lived. It's just fascinating. Gandhi came back to India in 1915. He was 45 years old. That's somewhat reassuring for someone like me. I turned 40 last month and I've been depressed for like weeks. 45. But look at the staggering pace. By 1925, my experiments with truth was written. By 1931, the round table happened. But it took all the way to 1942 for Quit India movement. And 47 for independence. So 22 years after his defining autobiography was written, it took that long for them to come home. I'm not 45 yet. I'm very sensitive about that. So, I think if something's going to take that long, okay, be it that great school, be it that district, be it that state, be it that country, or be it that one child you're working on, you need a taught theory. So here's the theory. The theory says that for change to happen, 4 things need to coincide for a long time. First, you need deep thought and deep knowledge. So I'm revising some of my notes. Apparently, between 1990 and 1914, he spent some time in jails in South Africa at that time. This was around the whole Tolstoy experiment. And that's when he reread all of Tolstoy and reread all of Thoreau. I think revisiting deep thought is extremely important, but in education as a domain, there is no possibility of deep thought. By the time you finish these 3 days, you will be reassured. There is nothing which blokes like me have to say which hasn't been said before. So whether it's Dewey or Gandhi or Montessori or Krishnamurti, or more practical examples of the Reggio Emilias of the world, there is great stuff out there. But why is it not spreading? Why? You got to ask that question. Why is it not spreading? It's not because the ideas are not there. The ideas are there. Because we are not able to infect society with that idea rapidly enough. And that therein lay the genius of Gandhi. The evening prayer meetings. Look at the political mastery of him. He's remembered as a secular god with devout Hindu practices in the evening prayer meeting. Masterstroke. Because how do you relate with that illiterate mother of 6 in the last village? Circle time, some of you may have heard of that. Just that prayer circle. One use smiling circle. But engaging people is not enough. You need to have a story on which they can act after that engagement. So whether it was jail bharo, let's fill up the jails, let's burn all the imported cloth, whether it was the march to Dandi, whether it was Quit India movement, the man always had an action story. So if I spend half an hour with you, you're going to say, okay, maybe I liked it, maybe I fell asleep and we all go back home. What do I do Monday morning? So he had a Monday morning story. Every 5 years there was a big Monday morning story. So I'm going to talk a little bit later why teacher training doesn't work, why it's a complete waste of time. And I make a living out of training. And the fourth, so we just stay in the theory, we're going to come back to it. Resources are very key. Very key. And I think this is very important for educators because we tend to be very shy about money, very complex about money, possibly confused about money. And unless there's a clear theory of constant resource generation, Gandhiji is written elsewhere. And my being a Baniya, for those of you who may be uninitiated, so India has a caste system in which there are pretty much like the feudal levels. So Gandhiji came from a caste group, which is the commercial group. Had a big difference to my understanding of how to get all the right people on my side. People don't write about it. The Birlas, the Sarabhais, the richest families were on side. As Nehruji once said, it takes millions to keep Gandhiji poor. So, in whatever little way, whether it is organizations like iDiscover or your school or your system, I think we need to keep examining, are we at the cutting edge of being thought? And not get stale and stuck in one paradigm. We have a million gods. We worship everyone. We have no problem. We're shameless about stealing an idea from anywhere as long as it works for children. If it doesn't work for children in the classroom, don't waste my time. Second, we need to constantly infect the audience. In our case, it is very often parents, but also teachers. You've got to convince them, show them how it works, and that's when you will get the support and patience. Third, you need a Monday morning story. And fourth, you need to know how to manage your finances. Wow, how are we doing? Are we okay? Just some body language. Fine. I'm 5 minutes over time, but I'll try and make up. I want to finally come down to the so what for education around some of these abstruse ideas I've been trying to speak of in the context of Gandhi's work in life. Many ways to cut the pie, but I have chosen this way, and I'm going to spend time on 4 ideas. I will mention those ideas and then give you a brief reference as to how in our work we are attacking it. Okay? Because that's how perhaps someone like me is a little more useful than anyone who's read up Gandhi and showed up here. If I was to take one idea from Gandhiji's writing and thinking on education, I think it's the whole notion of making education useful. Okay? It's also perhaps the most controversial because this got kind of slotted into something saying you're making children do commercial work. So for those of you who may be familiar with the idea of Nai Talim, deeply embedded into it is the idea of having children do craft work or handicraft, including for the purpose of selling it so that the schools can be sustained as economic systems. Now one direction is you get embroiled in that whole debate. Oh, so are you having a child labor factory and what are we talking about? I choose not to go there. We're going to talk about it, we can talk outside the room. But I'm saying, what can I take from this idea which is powerful and works? I think the notion that the process of education and learning has to be intrinsically useful, both to society and to the child, is very important. And in one stroke, cuts across so much of the nonsense you have to go through sitting in classrooms. If you're able to attack every question from this perspective of, is it useful or is it not? And if it's useful, show me the work product. So Gandhiji did speak of ideas which I'm sure in an audience like this you are practicing and certainly sensitive to. And education is not only here, but it's in the heart the use of craft, especially in the Indian context, weaving, agriculture, and so on and so forth. Lower levels of imposition, emphasizing play, letting children be children in that context. And I think the core idea here was to view school or education as an extension of the social context of not only the child but his or her family. So being cognizant of the professions they came from the work life they came from, and weaving school into that environment. Gandhiji was highly critical of the use of English in early education for very obvious reasons. I will not discuss that, but I think if someone wants to talk about it, we can talk about it later. And learning by doing as opposed to learning by memory, whether it's alphabet and so on and so forth. I think pretty much anyone who seriously studied modern education would not argue with some of these tendencies. But the evidence of this happening in any widespread way is very, very low or weak. We, in the last 6 years, have tried to put it on the ground. And this is what our take on it is. If you look at schools, sorry, it's kind of bright, so you don't see this very much. I think the overwhelming preoccupation in mainstream schools is around the objects of schools, whether it is the buildings or the equipment, and perhaps around the people as well. There's a lot of emphasis now on teacher quality and so on and so forth, which is very good. But I would argue, and I think it's completely consistent with something Gandhiji emphasized, that the sanctum sanctorum is the classroom or the transaction of learning and teaching. What is happening in that practice? And if that's a bedroom in which all windows and doors are shut, nobody is allowed to go in, how will it ever improve? So we are putting the torchlight on the actual practices of teaching and learning. And I think that is where Gandhi's idea of making work products useful is very powerful. That means breaking the tyranny of the one-way train. I'm not going to spend time on it because we heard a lot about it this morning. So there's syllabus and there are books, and then teachers are reduced to talking out of books, and then there are exams. We see the opportunities to change the one-way train into a cycle of learning. But decoding each of these 5 steps, it's so hard. It's so hard. Especially if you want to do it for all teachers in all classrooms and all schools. The all-talented teacher will do this. And she won't even know that she's doing this. But decoding it for everyone, if that is your agenda, then you got to do it this way. At least that's our learning. We all need to be clear about what goals and outcomes we are working for. This morning we spoke about unexpected outcomes. That's great. But you need a bar on what is expected too. Transitioning from them, some understanding of objectives which we teach to. Teachers having some sense of a plan I go with. I think maturity, talent is knowing when to abort the plan. But that's not a good enough reason not to have one. Danger, danger, danger. Once you have a plan, then you can focus on the true art of facilitation, where we spoke of observation, understanding, asking the right question, waiting, not telling the answer, so on and so forth. And then assessment, which is extremely hard, often confused for testing alone. How do you really know if children have got their money's worth? And is that a justified question or not? So, in our work, we try to touch on some of those areas, and I'm happy to share these questions that we come up. The second big message of Gandhi's work in education is the independence, and I choose to refer it as independence of the child. We will give the child a chance. So, 9-year-old Karthik is saying, this shadow was, we can't do it here, but let's, in the morning, the shadow was this long, now it's noon, and it's gone. So what do you say? mostly with teachers, they will say, because the sun has moved from here and there. I said, a child asks you this question, what do you say? No, actually the sun doesn't move, the earth moves. And the child asks you a question, what do you say? So which one gives the answer? And I said, what if for the first time you ask, so what do you think? The odds are you'll get a very, very interesting answer. Then I'll ask them go and try that, and they will just flabbergasted what their own children, their own biological children at home were able to do on things they are so much in a hurry to answer. So giving children the notion or the power to be self-sufficient in the act of learning, and I see the economic idea of Gandhi as a mere extension of that. Whether it is relevant today in certain settings or not, I think is a smaller point. But self-sufficiency is at the heart of the Gandhian idea of education, and I think that's a very powerful. We're taking baby cheetahs and making them into domestic cats. That's what our modern education, at least in the context of my country, is. Except for a few notable exceptions, and I would argue that many school systems around the world are the same. And I think a big idea in this, and I guess I'm taking gold to Newcastle here, is the simple idea of experience-based education. When children do, they become more confident. Allow them to fail a few times. Can that be built into your curriculum? Children are supposed to fail. If this guy hasn't failed, he can't learn anything. Actually, you haven't given him the value for his fee, perhaps, or the fee that is given. So I'm not going to go into the experiential learning cycle. You know that. I want to talk about it. So just doing stuff, whether it's physically or outdoors or community service, I think is something which needs to come back into schools in a big way. And perhaps Gandhi would have been a big supporter of that. This one actually excites me a little bit because there's little evidence in Gandhi's other writings that he would be the kind of guy who would be sensitive to this. I think this is the piece of him recognizing that when you're dealing with a 6-year-old, it's not the same as dealing with a 16-year-old. I think it's an underlying disease across systems. And perhaps even in the more progressive ones, people don't really segregate schooling of 6-year-olds from that of 9-year-olds from 12-year-olds in the design of curricula, in the design of the day, in the design of assessment, in the spacing of periods. There's a huge opportunity on how age appropriateness is built into the curriculum. I'm sure many of you are doing it, but for the most part, it is not done as much. He also had a very controversial stand on textbooks, implying that education through textbooks is a complete waste of time, which in a conservative society which was badly trying to be like its masters, probably got in the way of this kind of education taking root. And finally, the fourth big idea which I think Gandhi spent a lot of time talking and writing about was the role of the teacher for very obvious reasons. From his era and context, he spoke about character a lot and said the kind of people who need to come into teaching need to be very special kind of people. And he was a strong proponent of teachers being the kind where they can be a role model, an example to children, having a spirit of service, and getting them at any cost. He had no practical answers to it. And here's where perhaps our own experience on the ground suggests that India has 6 million teachers and we can debate till the cows come home how bad they are. We can't put them into the sea. So if you don't have a solution to improve it, you're just going to kind of, maybe attend a lot of conferences. We have to find a way to empower people who perhaps maybe are not the most spectacular sample of good teaching. And a couple of things which we've learned along the way which I'll share is that this is what I was saying, that our experience is if you give training in days or hours alone, the chances are you will see a spike in performance but then it soon starts going back to traditional practices. We find training supported with detailed curricula, with tools in class, with ongoing coaching is the kind that works. And if you don't have that comprehensive approach, you may get momentary satisfaction. Of course, for a very elite group or all your teachers have arrived, perhaps it may work in some special cases, but for the most part, solely training is perhaps an inadequate tool. What is very critical in professional development or teacher training we find is introducing reflective practice, or what we call the Gauss effect. That before you start telling them about multiple intelligences or constructivist practice or how to use activity in the classroom or how to work a certain worksheet, having them revisit their own notions of learning, their own notions of authority, of power. And this usually takes a little bit of time, and it is a bit annoying if you're trying to do it with a lot of teachers, but it works and it has a lot of value. Finally, I think teacher development is an ongoing process, and a lot of the things which Gandhiji talks about, I think putting them into practice is really, really hard. Extremely hard. What we heard this morning about the art of observation, knowing how children are different, how to plan well, how to understand outcomes, how to slowly develop your own philosophy of education is an ongoing journey which needs consistent leadership for it to evolve. So I could go on and on, as you might have guessed, but I'm going to stop. Thank you with pleasure. Thank you for listening to me. I'm just going to end with this small quotation, which I think previous one. I'll just type it in one bit. And I think this is so important. We do not need to proselytize either by our speech or by our writing. We can only do so really with our lives. Let our lives be open books for all to study. Mohandas Gandhi. Thank you so much for listening. We have about 10 minutes, I think, because I ran over a little bit. Today it was Amukta because she knows a little bit about what I've done, and I spoke on this 4 years ago in Bhubaneswar, and perhaps she heard something about it. But I told you right up front that to me Gandhi is seductive because of his commitment to action. I think what our era needs is action. Obama has just spoken about action and see what's happened. Just imagine if he started doing something.
So we need an action now.
I think he's an action hero.
The right action.
The process of learning. And the second is the independence of the child, which she writes so eloquently in Discovery of the Child, which is comparing it with the bureaucratic office and traditional classroom. And I think Gandhi stood for the independence of the child. So there's a very natural resonance between what Gandhiji wrote, what Maria Montessori stood for, or for that matter even John Dewey. I mean, there's a coincidence in the first half of the century around these ideas.
And also to answer your question.
When she really came, just a drop of line. It might take a day because I travel a lot. I live